Hey dear friends, Patrick here. We are making our way through God and the State, this short book by Michael Bakunin, or Mikhail Bakunin, his Russian name. And it's a short little book, as you can see. It's only 80 some pages. And we're picking up from about page 20. I did a little intro on it on the first video, and this is the second video where I'll be talking about it. He considers himself on page 20 a materialist and revolutionary socialist. So he was a contemporary of Karl Marx, and they influenced each other. Now the difference was that Marx promoted the uprising of the working class, what they call the proletariat. They wanted the working class to rise up and take over everything and take the factors of wealth away from the bourgeoisie, which was the term he used for the owners of the factors of production. And then when the uprising was accomplished, then the state could take over everything. Whereas Bakunin didn't want the state to take over everything. He only wanted the people to somehow be able to rule themselves. And he was an anarchist, so he didn't believe in any state intervention, whereas Marx wanted the state to eventually take over once the working class were able to gain power from the existing power structures that were existing in place at the time. So you'll hear those terms often whenever people are talking about Marx and communism. You just have to keep in mind the proletariat was considered the working class people, and the bourgeoisie was referring to the owners of that made their wealth by owning assets, right? Owning property. Or sometimes they'd even use the term the petite bourgeoisie would be the upper middle class that had access to assets, as opposed to the working class who were essentially poor and just traded their time for money and had a constant struggle to stay afloat, sort of thing. So those terms are very common, and they come up here in this little book as well very often. So don't be intimidated by these terms. They're just, popular terms for people dealing with that particular topic. So as we continue on, he talks a lot about science being the ultimate aim of human achievement, and how science considers anything to do with the metaphysical or religion to be absurd. He uses that word a lot. He talks a lot about how he detests any power that's influential over the individual, and either through the state or through the church. And by the church, he refers in particular, he points out the Roman Catholic Church very often. And then he says the only remedy for that is social revolution. That's what he calls it. And so in that sense, he is very similar to Marx. They wanted to have a revolution and turn over the existing structures. Both Marx and Bakunin would be happy to see what's happening in France today. All this social unrest, they love that because it gives an opportunity to tear down the existing power structures so that a communist structure could come in and take over. Or in the case of Bakunin, he would just say that they would tear down the existing structures and replace it with nothing. And somehow, miraculously, the working class would be able to manage themselves. So his ideas are, he's always talking about absurd. His ideas are extremely absurd. So a couple of things I wanted to point out quickly for you. I don't want to make this a long video. I don't want to give him too much time and attention, because he's really an evil Luciferian individual who is probably suffering greatly in hell at the moment. Whether that's actual flames or just the flames of regret, I don't know. I don't know the condition of his soul, but the legacy that he left is a manifesto of atheism and influenced a lot of other important people. And so he has a legacy of evil. He says here, if God is, then man is a slave. This is on page 25. If God is, man is a slave. Now man can and must be free. Then God does not exist. He says, I defy anyone whomsoever to avoid this circle. Now, therefore, let all choose. So he says, if God exists, he'd have to have all this power. And because he has all this power, it would essentially make man a slave. And so he says, because he doesn't want to be a slave, he's not willing to be a slave, right? He has the same spirit that was in those individuals in the parables that our teacher taught us, that they said, we will not have this man rule over us. This is at the heart of Bakunin, right? His main motivating heart's desire is one of rebellion. Anyway, so he says, if God is, then man is a slave. Now, this is interesting because he's obviously ignorant of the teachings of Christ, who said in John 15:15, right? He says in that passage that I no longer call you slaves henceforth, right? He says, he almost agrees with Bakunin. He says, before, your relationship to God throughout the Old Testament, throughout the relationship between the Israelites and Jehovah, was one of slaves. In fact, he even says that, at the time, he says, you put God first, and after you've done everything you're supposed to do, you say, we're unprofitable slaves. We're unprofitable servants. That's how you increase your faith to God. You put God in the position of the master, and you as being the slave. But he says in John 15:15, he says, I no longer call you slaves, but now I call you friends, because I haven't hidden anything from you. I've told you everything that the Father wanted me to share with you. So now I call you friends. So there's that transition as he's preparing to die for the people, when he gathers them together at Passover and says, look, this is how it is now, right? I'm your friends. I'm going to be seated at the right hand of the Father. I'm going to be on your side forevermore until your enemies become your footstool. Essentially, what was the promise in Psalms through David to the Christ, saying that, come sit at my right hand, and your spirit is going to pervade the earth over time. And we're living through that today, that God's spirit is still working and growing throughout humanity. But so the author is obviously ignorant of that, right? He doesn't realize that Christ said that, and that destroys his argument. And he's very harsh in his description. He says that religion destroys reason. He says it's the principal instrument of human incapacitation. It reduces them to imbecility. He goes on and makes these harsh statements against anything that would cause someone to acknowledge or serve God. Again, he says, if God is, he is necessarily the eternal, supreme, absolute master. Indeed, he is. But the way he finishes the sentence here, for if God is, this is on page 27, he is necessarily the eternal, supreme, absolute master. And if such a master exists, man is a slave. Now, if he is a slave, neither justice, nor equality, nor fraternity, nor prosperity are possible for him. And see how he misses the whole point, that we are no longer considered slaves, but what a great hope, a great blessing, a great promise that we have, that we could be called the sons of God, that we could be called the friends of Christ, right? He misses that entirely. And so we have this opportunity for equality, for fraternity, for prosperity, all the things that he said are impossible with the existence of a God. Justice, prosperity, fraternity, all those things are possible because of what Christ did for us. And he misses that entirely. He doesn't see it. He never saw it throughout his life. He was blind to it. And instead, he was blinded by his desire for absolute and total rebellion, absolute and total anarchy, and it drove him into a state of complete and utter apostasy, right? And so he tries to gaslight a number of times. He calls people stupid. He reverses the phrase of Voltaire, saying that if God didn't exist, we'd have to create him. And instead, he says, if God really existed, it would be necessary to abolish him. That's his kind of claim to fame, is that statement. Apparently, that was quite a popular statement in the late 1800s. And he says that authority, he says, a word and a thing that he detests with all his heart. See, he's not willing to recognize the authority of God, but instead he recognizes the authority of evil, right? Because his whole reasoning is that we must rebel. He says we must rebel. What must we rebel against? He's rebelling against God because he's constantly talking about God, right? He's an atheist, But he says we have to rebel against God. We have to rebel against the state. We have to rebel against the Catholic Church. His main rebellion is against God. And in fact, he goes on, and later he becomes even much more specific in that he says we must rebel against Christ himself. And he's able to insert intelligent paragraphs here and there. Like, for example, he says here, the liberty of man consists solely in this, that he obeys natural laws because he has himself recognized them as such, and not because they have been externally imposed upon him by any intrinsic will, whatever, divine or human, collective or individual. He goes on, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but he's talking about how we recognize the natural laws, like the laws of gravity and, the way the planets move or what have you, right? We recognize them as common sense, natural laws. And so he's able to be very lucid at times and explain things in a way that are very sensible and appeal to the inherent logic or the inherent common sense that we all have. And so if you're not prepared for what he's spouting, what his argument leads to, you could easily be deceived by his arguments that are contrary to the acknowledgement of God. He hates anything to do with a person in power. And that goes along with, like, for example, here on page 31, he says, it is the characteristic of privilege and of every privileged position to kill the mind and heart of men. The privileged man, whether politically or economically, is a man depraved in mind and heart. It's hard to argue. That's actually kind of funny. It's hard to argue against that when you see the type of people that are in power today, the politicians that are in power today, men that are depraved in mind and heart. He's not far off, and that goes with the old adage or truism that says power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So I think he'd be a fan of that statement. So I'm not going to do too much else here for the next few pages. I've reached page 60, so there's only another 20 pages to go, but I'm not going to go into every single detail here. It's funny because he says there is no universal man. He says a man that wouldn't be subject to corruption. And he says if there was, it'd be necessary to drive this man out of society. Yeah, there was a man like that, Jesus Christ, right? He was a man without corruption. He had the Holy Spirit without measure, and they did try to destroy him. So sometimes he's not far off. And like I said, sometimes he makes very insightful comments, but he misses the forest for the trees in a huge, huge way. So these are things that I would have to sit down and gather up all my notes, because it would bore you to tears for me to go through every detail where he's absolutely, completely wrong. And in fact, a number of times where his commentary is really quite stupid. But as I said, I'll probably put those in some notes, and I'll gather up those notes into a summary of some kind and try and present that in case somebody's interested. Then I'll have a small essay myself available to share with you. But for now, I'm just going to leave it at that. And if there's something that really is particular that jumps out at me, I will try and share it with you. And I might do like 1 or 2 more videos on this particular book. But for now, I think I'll leave it at that for today. So thank you so much for watching. God bless you. I hope you're doing well. Again, I'm just covering God and the State by Mikhail Bakunin, a very influential atheist of his day. He was a contemporary of Karl Marx. He was influenced a lot by Charles Darwin. He calls men, just another descendant of gorillas, he calls them. Now, again, if you've read Darwin, you know that Darwin wasn't able to explain everything. He was a naturalist. He traveled, by ship, and he went to all these different places. He went to the Galapagos Islands, and he saw a lot of stuff. And his main theory of evolutionary ideas, right, were not able to explain everything that he saw. And he readily admitted that. There were some things that he felt were a real mystery and could not be explained by natural selection. Now, as far as I know, Darwin didn't mention this one, but I'll just mention it to you here for a second, because we always get to that thing. And Darwin coming on the scene in the 1800s at the same time that he was living Same time Marx was living. This was causing a bombshell for a lot of people to incorporate into their way of thinking. And they said, oh, well, if it's just natural selection, if we just evolved from fish and small amoebas and then it, on and on and on, the story of evolution. But again, I read some of Darwin's work, and he readily admitted he was not able to explain everything that he saw. And one thing I want to share with you, to think of this when people talk about evolution, is you take a creature that is a caterpillar. It is a caterpillar. That's what it is. It's a big, long worm with a bunch of legs on it. And it goes in, and it, at a specific time, right, it's eating all these leaves, it's gaining weight and it's growing. And at a specific time, it goes in and it wraps itself up into a little cocoon they call a chrysalis. You know where I'm going, right? And it goes inside this little cocoon for a short period of time, and it comes out of there as a butterfly, an entirely distinct, separate creature. Not over eons, not over millions of years, not through natural selection. None of that. There is no natural selection in going from one animal to a second animal in a matter of weeks. That is the mystery and the almost magical power of God's creation that he instituted upon the earth. The variety, there's no reason necessary for a peacock to have feathers that are 6 feet high. Birds attract each other with all kinds of weird, different, mysterious methods, but it's the variety, right? The absolute variety that has nothing to do with natural selection. It doesn't give it any advantage other than somebody being extremely creative and saying, let's make it different so that they do this, right? This is the amazing creative ability of God that trumps these theories that men come up with and say, oh, well, it must have been this creature first, and then a spider and a spider web. Was there a spider that started by making a web that was just like 2 strands, and it said, oh, these spiders were able to catch more because they built the web bigger? No, a spider makes a web just it's made to do that. A beaver is made to make a dam. It's made to do that. That innate, God-given innate ability that certain creatures have. They didn't develop that over millions and millions of years. That's absolute nonsense. That's an absurdity to say that a creature was a caterpillar and then over millions of years it learned this technique to survive better by turning into a butterfly. That is absolutely incoherent, illogical. There's no way to explain that. And even if you read the most accomplished atheists of today, in particular would be Richard Dawkins, he reaches an absolute brick wall when he argues for the creation of life. He said, well, there just had to have been a first cell. There just had to have been not only a first cell, but a first cell that was able to replicate itself. The ability of a cell to replicate itself is a complex mystery that scientists are still barely able to describe. You'd need pages and pages of information to describe how a cell replicates itself. And Richard Dawkins, when he's pushed to the wall, says, well, the first one just had to have happened. That's what they come to. They've got nothing. They don't have some kind of magical chemical reaction that created life. No. God created life. God sustains life. Christ explained that to us, that God is the creator of the universe. He's the creator of me and you, and he loves us very, very much, cares about us, right? He set before us life and death. He wants us to choose life, not choose evil and rebellion like this guy has done and influenced so many people today, saying that, oh, the only way that society can survive if it turns communist and all power goes to the state, a totalitarian, authoritarian state. That's the only thing that they can hope for. They have nothing else because they don't rely on God. And even in Bakunin, he talks about ethics. Where do you get ethics from? You can't just pull them out of thin air, right? God gave us ethics via the 10 Commandments, by the teachings he gave to the Israelites. And then Christ clarified them for us, right? He even summarized them into an easier package, saying, love God and love your neighbor as yourself. So anyway, I'm not going to go on. I'm reached my time limit. So thank you for watching. I love you very much. God bless you. We'll talk to you again real soon. I'll cover some more as I get through this. Take care of yourself. Have a great day. Bye-bye.